In this lecture, we will explore religious diversity in pre-Islamic Arabia. This lecture is on the interactions between religious communities in pre-Islamic Arabia. This is the map of pre-Islamic Arabia just before the beginning of Islam in the early 7th century. We can see to the north of Arabia the two dominant powers at the time, the Byzantine Empire and also the Sassanid Empire to the east. In this lecture, we will explore the various social, political, and cultural interactions between different religious communities in pre-Islamic Arabia in general and Mecca and Medina in the western part of Arabia in particular, very briefly, focusing on both the existent two monotheistic religions, that is Judaism and Christianity, and various polytheistic traditions that existed in pre-Islamic Arabia. We will also explore briefly the different social, political, and economic structures that facilitated the relations between those different religious traditions. This discussion of context should then help us think about how the religious other, that is, people who belonged to religious traditions other than Islam, was constructed in the Quran and in Islam more generally. Let us first explore why we should study pre-Islamic Arabia in a course on Islam and religious diversity. Well, in order to get a better sense of the Islamic ideas generated by the Quran and by the Prophet Muhammad's practice in the early 7th century of the Common Era, we need to have some sense of the context in which these Islamic ideas developed or emerged. In particular, we need to gain a sense of the broader context of the kind of relations that existed between people of different religious traditions in pre-Islamic times in Arabia. We also need to understand the cultural roots of early Islamic policies put in place by the Prophet Muhammad and the early caliphs or the rulers with regard to the religious other. But how can we find out this kind of information, given that the context of the Quran was so many centuries ago? This question is really about what kind of source documents we can use to understand the situation in pre-Islamic Arabia with reference to the people of various religious traditions. Let me mention some of these possible sources we can use. This is very much a historical study, and therefore historical sources that explore what the situation was like in pre-Islamic Arabia are important. Arabic literature and literary sources of the time may also be useful, as well as Islamic historical sources that refer to the pre-Islamic situation and conditions. Given that the Quran is closely connected to the time and historical context of Arabia, we can also use Quranic references to various practices, values, or norms that existed in pre-Islamic times. At times, the Quran critiques such ideas or values, while at other times it approves of some ideas and values. One example could be the Quran's criticism of some of the Christian beliefs, or the reference it makes to some of the conflicts that existed between people of different religious traditions in Arabia. There are two ways of looking at pre-Islamic Arabia: a religious view and a non-religious historical view. An important point to note is that when we look at pre-Islamic Arabia in the context of exploring inter-religious relations, there are two ways of looking at pre-Islamic Arabia. Or in other words, there are two narratives or stories about pre-Islamic Arabia. There is a Muslim religious narrative, which is very common among Muslims, which often sees pre-Islamic Arabia in a particular way that is, from a Muslim religious perspective. In this narrative, pre-Islamic Arabia is seen as a place where there is, or where there was, little culture or good or positive values or institutions. The standard Muslim view is that pre-Islamic Arabia should be characterized as a time of ignorance, lawlessness, violence, lack of culture, godlessness, lack of faith in God, and endless wars. Obviously, not all Muslims take this view, but this view is very common. The other narrative is a non religious historical narrative, where historians look at pre Islamic Arabia based on data from a variety of sources. This non religious narrative is unconcerned about the Muslim religious narrative. But when we look at the non religious historical narrative, it does not necessarily agree with the Muslim narrative by and large. For the historians, when we look at pre Islamic Arabia, different parts of Arabia had different conditions, different characteristics, different problems, and different issues and challenges. For the historian, some parts of Arabia had flourishing cultures with rich literature and sophisticated ideas about organization of society, and of course, rich religious traditions. This can be seen in the northern parts of Arabia as well as in the south, that is, south of Arabia. Judaism and Christianity were widespread at the time, and there was definitely a strong belief in the one God. Interaction between religious communities may have been by and large positive too. In fact, for many people in pre Islamic Arabia, religion may not have been the most important aspect of their identity. This may well be particularly true for those who followed various polytheistic traditions. Christians and Jews may have had a stronger sense of religious identity, but even then, for them, tribal identity may well have been extremely important. What this means is that conflicts may well be mostly driven by tribal concerns rather than religious concerns. It also means that despite the different religious traditions in pre Islamic Arabia, interaction between religious communities, by and large, was positive, and tolerance of the religious other would have been a key part of pre Islamic life. Let us now look at the social and political context in which the people of pre Islamic Arabia who belonged to different religious traditions operated. Let us look at the tribe and tribal identity first. Put most simply, the Arabian society on the eve of Islam was tribal. The individual in such a society saw himself or herself as belonging to several interrelated groups that expressed membership in a much larger group that we could call the tribe. These groups provided the individual with varying degrees of support in social situations and were the focus of the individual's loyalty. The smallest and most immediate of such groups was, of course, the family, which formed the ultimate focus of an individual's feelings of solidarity. But the individual also felt himself or herself to be a member of a somewhat broader group that included several closely related families, those of the individual's paternal uncles, for example, as well as his or her own. Beyond this were yet broader groups of increasingly distant relatives that also could serve as sources of solidarity at some times. The largest solidarity group of this kind, which provided the individual with effective social support, was what we can call the tribe. The tribe then was essentially seen as a body of blood relations and was normally defined as being all those people descended in the male line from some ancestor. fellow tribesmen or tribeswomen were supposed to stand together against the outsider. The Arabian population then was divided into such tribes, and it was to his or her tribe that an individual felt his or her primary loyalty. The tribe or one of its subgroups was the individual's only defense against insult or injury in his or her dealings with society as a whole. So, if a man, for example, broke with his tribe, as a few pre-Islamic poets apparently did, he had no choice but to face life alone and in virtual isolation. What this tells us is that whatever his or her way of life, the Arabian was first and foremost a tribesman or a tribeswoman. They identified with their tribe, they were loyal to it, and they secured as much as possible against abuse by the tribe. This was as true of the fully settled populations of the north or south of Arabia, or the oasis towns scattered throughout the peninsula, such as Medina, as it was of the nomadic peoples of Central Arabia. So you can probably start to sense that the social formations at this time were vastly different to how we understand social and political life today. Nevertheless, we can understand the tribe as a kind of social institution that relied on familial solidarity and loyalty, which provided the only means of socio-cultural recognition and which, most importantly, provided the only means of protection of even one's life. So, on a social level, the tribe was the dominant form of identity. But the ways in which the various tribes operated were numerous, by which I mean not all tribes were alike and indeed often led very different ways of life. This meant that complex and often volatile political structures operated through Arabia, which would eventually come to be dismantled to a large extent by Prophet Muhammad and his followers. Let us look at the nomadic and settled communities. As I have just mentioned, not all the Arabian tribes led the same way of life, and this was most evident in economic terms. There was rather a great variety of lifestyles ranging across the spectrum from fully nomadic through partly nomadic to several different kinds of fully settled life in villages or towns. Power relationships among the various groups of the peninsula were normally very complex. The existence of nomadic and settled ways of life, the constant flux between them, the existence of varieties of social and cultic or religious ties, the economic interdependence and rivalry, all such things affected the forms of political life of pre Islamic Arabia. Let us look at power relations. Generally, the dominance of one tribal group over others assumed one of two forms. A tribe could dominate others directly by virtue of its sheer military power, forming a kind of warrior aristocracy among them. Or it could dominate others indirectly by serving as a kind of religious aristocracy. In general, nomadic groups formed the focus of real power in the region and became the core of the dominant warrior aristocracies. The organization of society along tribal lines, however, meant that it was not merely the strong nomadic groups themselves, but rather the tribes to which they belonged that were powerful. Within such tribes, even those individuals or groups who were not themselves physically powerful exercised considerable social power because their tribal support was intimidating. So let us focus on power based on religion and the concept of haram, which is an Arabic word. Haram means a sacred enclave or a sacred space. Haram as an important institution was evident at this time, which was not tied to nomadic military power, but the very opposite. Indeed, some settled communities were able to exercise considerable power under certain conditions. And I should note that this power is the kind that eventually saw the rise of Mecca in both economic and political terms. So, to paint a picture, at this time, some places and towns served as market centers and cultic centers for pre Islamic people and formed often an area that was called a haram or sacred enclave or a place or a space. Each haram was dominated by a holy family. The Holy Family claimed to be the servants or priests of the god or goddess who resided there and the guardian of his or her shrine. Well, this can be a special spring or rock or tree, for example, that people worshipped. Those who adhered to the cult of that god recognized the sanctity of the shrine and of the sacred space around it, agreeing to observe a number of regulations imposed by the Holy Family. These regulations related in part to the cultic practices at the shrine, but also included others that had important social and political implications. In particular, murder was always forbidden in the haram, which meant that a tribesman could enter it without fear of molestation by even his bitterest enemy. The haram thus became important as a neutral ground where feuding tribes could send representatives to engage in negotiations. Within such a setting, it was possible for the Holy Family to acquire great power. Some members of the family, notably the mansib in Arabic, or the head of the cult, were frequently called upon to adjudicate disputes among the tribes. The haram could then function as a focus for political consolidation, enabling the Holy Family and its head to acquire considerable political power. Like the warrior aristocracy, the holy families in Arabia, who formed a kind of religious aristocracy, were considered noble, primarily because they could provide real security for weaker tribesmen and tribeswomen and groups who sought protection within the confines of the haram. One such haram was in Mecca, where Islam began and where Prophet Muhammad was born. The haram was around Kaaba, which is the most sacred building or structure for Muslims. Muslims believe that the Kaaba was built centuries ago by Prophet Abraham and his son Ishmael for the worship of one God. However, over time, people living in Mecca moved away from the worship of one God to the worship of many gods. Just before the rise of Islam, the Kaaba apparently had over 300 idols or gods placed in or around Kaaba. This, of course, meant that the tribes from around the region or Arabia in general continued to visit the Kaaba for pilgrimage. The continuous flow of visitors to the Kaaba meant significant levels of interaction between people of different tribes and religions, as well as facilitation of trade, making Mecca a vibrant place. This important place of Mecca in pre-Islamic times, of course, will continue with the rise of Islam. The Prophet Muhammad would later cleanse the Kaaba of all idols and emphasize the worship of one God and re-establish pilgrimage to Mecca, but the focus of the pilgrims will be one God. Let us look at the organization of the community and the issue of law and justice very briefly. As I said earlier, the structures of social identity of pre-Islamic Arabia were very different to the ways in which we identify in contemporary life. Similarly, as I'm sure you can now tell, the political structures were very different too. Can you identify what political structure, one that we are most familiar with, is missing from this picture? It is, of course, the state. And it can be argued that the complexity and fragmentation of political life in northern and central Arabia in particular was in part due to this absence of the state. The lack of state organization was also evident in the absence of any overriding concept of a law beyond the limits of the tribe. Power relationships were simply a question of the strength of one individual or group against another, and they were hardly affected by notions of justice enshrined in a system of laws. What I'm trying to say here is that there was no law in the sense of an abstract principle of justice against which one should judge the individual claim, nor was there any acceptance of the notion that such a generalized set of regulations could be binding on the individual. But this does not mean that within each tribe, and sometimes even between tribes, there were no understandings or norms that are associated with what we call law. It is for this reason that the tribe assumed such importance in day to day life. For in the absence of any notion of an overriding law or authority to judge disputes, the individual's only defense was simply to be stronger than his or her opponent from, say, from another tribe, and their only insurance against abuse, as we have discussed earlier, was. It is for this reason that the tribe assumed such importance in day to day life. In the absence of any notion of an overriding law or authority to judge disputes, the individual's only defense was simply to be stronger than his or her opponent, say from another tribe, and their only insurance against abuse was the ability of their own tribe to retaliate. The rise of Islam marked the one period in history when a state successfully brought all of Arabia, that is, nomadic and settled communities alike, firmly under its control. This is an episode perhaps unique in the history of Arabia until recent times. So let us again paint a historical picture. We will touch on the advent of Islam and the new social and political structures that it ushered in a little later in another lectures. First, we must get a good picture of how the existing social and political structures enabled the different religious communities and groupings of the region to interact. Here we will focus on the Jewish, Christian, and polytheistic traditions that were present at the time, and we will ask how these traditions and their ways of relating to one another may have come to shape some of the Islamic ideas of the religious other that developed later. Let us look at the interreligious relations between Jews, Christians, and polytheists in pre-Islamic Arabia very briefly. Well, long before the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad, Arabic-speaking Jews and Christians were making their way into Arabia. Jews had lived there for centuries, and they had even briefly ruled a kingdom in south of Arabia at the turn of the 5th and 6th centuries of the Common Era. But the centers of Jewish religious life at the time were located outside of Arabia, in the Aramaic-speaking regions of northern Palestine and in modern-day Iraq, while the centers of Christianity in the east were in places like Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, and in parts of modern-day Iran at the time of the rise of Islam. Christians had long been coming into the Arabian heartland from all sides. Within Arabia, there were many Christian tribes in different parts of Arabia. Arabia was also literally surrounded by Christian enclaves in the towns and villages of South Arabia, in Ethiopia and Egypt, in Sinai, Palestine, and Syria, and in Mesopotamia and in Persia. Even more present in Arabia were the Jews. At the time of the Prophet Muhammad, the Jews had a long history in Arabia and were well integrated into both urban and rural environments as urban craftsmen, traders, farmers, and Bedouin. Many Arab clans and tribes had Jewish members representing various aspects of Arabian life. Importantly, also, there were strong connections between Arabian Jewish communities and Jews in places like Persia and in Palestine. At Prophet Muhammad's birth in or around 570 of the Common Era, the Jewish communities in the Hijaz, which is in the western part of Arabia, had lost some of their political and economic power to the rising fortunes of the Meccans, although there was still a strong cultural presence. So, what is crucial to note here is that Prophet Muhammad was born into complex economic and political context, and also into a social and cultural context of significant interreligious setting. Jews could be found in all areas of Arabian society, and Christians too were very much present. I would like now to highlight that alongside the various monotheistic traditions, Judaism and Christianity, there were various forms of polytheism. Polytheistic traditions entailed the worship of a multitude of idols, many of which were objects of local worship and restricted to certain tribes. Although they existed among various Arabs, pagan rituals and beliefs were quite evident in Mecca as well. Other objects of worship, such as stars and fire, existed among some Bedouins, but idols were preeminent. Paganism offered the pre-Islamic Arabs an explanatory framework for nature, but the framework was devoid of guidance for practical life or warning of ethical consequences. The existence of these different social and religious groupings played a significant part in the way the religious other came to be identified in Islam later. Let us now look at Prophet Muhammad and the interreligious relations very briefly. With the advent of Islam and Prophet Muhammad's subsequent move from Mecca to Medina in 622 of the Common Era, a new political entity or a religious and political entity was established, which I will argue sought to address interreligious relations. At the time of arrival of the Prophet in Medina in 622, there were five major tribes in Medina. Three of them were Jewish and two were non-Jewish. Most of the non-Jewish tribes belonged to the polytheistic traditions. With the Prophet's arrival, the two non-Jewish tribes largely converted to Islam, while the Jewish tribes remained Jewish. In line with the pre-Islamic tolerance that existed then, as well as the tolerance that the Quran emphasized, Prophet Muhammad did not have any agenda to push or force people to convert to Islam. In fact, in Medina, he sought to bring under the umbrella of the political community that he created Muslims as well as the Jews as full members of the community. This can be seen clearly in the agreement that he concluded very early on with all sections of the Medinan community. This agreement is usually referred to as the Constitution of Medina or the Charter of Medina. This agreement or the charter signified the beginning of a political entity that consciously and explicitly sought to facilitate positive interaction between different religious groups. The agreement did not discriminate against non-Muslims, in particular here the Jews of Medina, because of the differences in religion. The agreement treats the Jews as equal to Muslims. The rights and obligations in the agreement are the same for Muslims and the Jews. There are no restrictions placed on the Jews in this agreement as far as their religious practices are concerned. This agreement or the Constitution of Medina has been regarded by Muslims in the past as the foundation for granting other religious groups like Jews a place in the Islamic polity with certain rights. While doctrinal quarrels certainly existed between Muslims and the Jews, so long as the pact remained in force, day-to-day existence was composed of neighborliness, visits between Muslims and Jews, and fruitful commerce and other positive interactions. As well as this important historical moment, Prophet Muhammad's vision of the new community in which Jews and Christians would participate with Muslims is more broadly manifest in the Quran. We see, for example, Quranic rules and regulations that tried to bind everyone together through things such as simple as dietary laws. If I could quote the Quran here, it says, "The food of those who have been given scripture, that is, Jews and Christians, is lawful for you," meaning Muslims, "and your food," meaning Muslims' food, "is lawful for them," meaning Jews and Christians. Dietary practices have bound Jews, for example, together and separated them from others. And it is reasonable to expect that this Quranic law or ruling or rule was intended to have the same effect in binding the new multi-confessional community. The key point to remember is that the kind of positive interactions that existed among peoples of different religious traditions in pre-Islamic Arabia in places like Mecca and Medina were in a sense accommodated within the new religion, that is Islam. Social relations between religious groups and even political alliances with people of different religious traditions continued under the Prophet Muhammad. Monotheistic religions such as Christianity and Judaism were given a special place within Islam. Jews and Christians were considered people of the book or scripture. Even those who worshipped multiple gods were tolerated, and good neighborly relations continued as long as they were prepared to live in peace with Muslims. People who belonged to other religious traditions, be they monotheistic or polytheistic, were not to be forced to convert to the new religion, Islam. All people were supposed to have freedom to believe or not to believe in any religion, including Islam. This kind of attitude towards other religious traditions and people of other faiths was in part facilitated by the social and political context in which people of these different religious traditions functioned in pre-Islamic times. The Prophet Muhammad accommodated a range of positive ideas, values, and norms that helped harmonious relations between people of different religions in pre-Islamic Arabia. And of course, he introduced many new ideas. There's a lot in the Quran on the issue of interreligious relations, but this lecture is not focused on that. We will cover that in another lecture. So, in summary, in this lecture, I have tried to provide you with a general historical overview of the ways in which the different religious traditions or groupings of pre Islamic Arabia functioned and related to one another. There were a range of ideas, values, and institutions that facilitated positive inter-religious relations in pre-Islamic Arabia, and a range of such ideas and values were accommodated by Prophet Muhammad into the new religion, Islam. We will look at a range of examples of ideas and values that Prophet Muhammad introduced into this space in a later lecture. Thanks for watching.